Hey, David, thank you for coming in. You have just a really outstanding background in technology and finance, and in fact, originally in investment banking with people like Goldman Sachs and the Royal Bank of Scotland, HSBC. There's like the names globally. Also on the steering committee for the blockchain, for the UN Charter Values and SDG Action Plan 100 plus. I mean, the list goes on, including as a contributor to this task force for nature-related financial disclosure, and decades of experience with government and private sector, and of course now you have this biodiversity impact funding startup, which I think is really interesting. So let's mine some of that experience, and I really appreciate you coming in and sharing all of your insights with our audience.
Stephen, thank you so much, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And when one puts these resumes together, it sounds fancier than it is. Yes, but these are things that we've done.
Now, David, my audience is quite diverse. So I have CEOs and investors, but also scientists and engineers. I mean, it really runs a spectrum, and students. And considering all of their backgrounds, they're always curious about what are the inflection points, and people like yourself, notable people have done so much good for the world that created this wonderful person that you are today. And it could be something that when you were really young, or maybe something in your family, could be when you're going to school, et cetera, or inflection points in your career. If you can name or talk about maybe two or three of those points in your life that were really change makers for you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And yeah, I mean, it's such a privilege to be alive at this time. But it's interesting that death was a major inflection point at a young age. I lost a sister when I was young, and it's death is just so final, isn't it? And it's so complete, and you can't argue with it. It just is what it is. And it really brings a lot of the deeper questions about what am I doing here? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And obviously, this is not it didn't happen then. These things bubble away in the background, and I obviously pursued and continue to pursue an entrepreneurial sort of business oriented life. But the whole time, this inflection point, or this issue of death has been something that has guided me. And it's these sometimes difficult things that, as the way you phrased it, what molded me into the shape that I'm in now, are these things. Sometimes these difficulties really are there to make us grow. And so yeah, that was one thing. So it's always been this tension between living one's life, but also being very aware of the fact that you might not be here for long. Tomorrow you might not be here. And as a consequence, what can I do now? What can I do today that will be of value? And so that's been a question that has plagued me and driven me. What can we actually do? Acquiring wealth and acquiring status and all of these things is nice, and I'm not against any of it. But there are the deeper things that I think, especially in the world that we're living in now, we really need to engage with and come through on. And that's so death was one. Another was funnily enough, and this is going to expose my age, spreadsheets. They came onto the market when I was just starting to do a bit of my consultancy work in the investment sort of banking world, and they had such a revolutionary impact. And I sort of cottoned onto them early, and have really leveraged the power. And I know, from a tech point of view, they are a complete nightmare. I mean, spreadsheet hell is often bandied around corporates because they are terrible from a systemic and from a developer's sort of point of view. But as a financial person, because I sort of have feet in two parts of the world. One is tech and one is finance, and that financial part as a tool to very quickly model and play with sort of financial numbers and stuff like that. They're very powerful, and obviously with the ability to connect to big data in the back end and crunch data in the back end and bring that through into a spreadsheet and visualize it and play with variables and all the rest, was a very that was big. It was a big thing for me, and I mean that's just a very small little inflection point from a tech point of view, and obviously more recently a really big thing. Having developed financial systems and having deployed financial systems and having dealt with all the problems that one deals with when you are deploying centralized systems. Well, not probably, some big advantages to centralized systems, but the advent of blockchain, just the whole decentralized nature and the revolutionary sort of way in which we can now hold digital assets, which we couldn't do prior to that. I mean, the security issues and all of those components prior to blockchain really it's a fundamental shift that I don't think we've even started to sort of feel, because the financial models that one has when one looks at things like yield farming or the whole blockchain sort of digital finance space. And I don't think they've sort of quite come to fruition yet. And there's still many challenges in that space. And funnily enough, I went very firmly into the cryptocurrency space, but I've reversed out of that in the space that I'm operating in. But certainly that, and then obviously AI is just really big at the moment, and it's really having a major impact. So yeah, those are a couple of the inflection points that have brought me to the place that I'm in right now.
I mean, that's a compelling narrative story arc in that you suffered loss and that had a major impact on your life, and then sort of completely in a different direction, and that is spreadsheets, the advent of spreadsheets, because you're able to automate or bring some structure when you're doing calculations or modeling and so on. I know, because I used to use a slide rule. So, and I remember when calculators came out, and then of course, then you had the ability to store and represent, because spreadsheets it was like embedded memory, right? You could store information in there together with calculating and so on.
Yes.
And then you're talking about the advent of blockchain and this aspect of distributed finance or decentralization that can occur with blockchain, and how you can be assured maybe of the data and so on. The thing is, though, blockchain is also controversial today, right? You see all the regulatory agencies around the world cracking down on many of the exchanges and so on. So we'll see what the outcome of that is. And then you then talked about AI, and now the feeling that AI, especially with these large foundation models, of which generative AI is one example, or future models are another example, they're seeing now like being electricity, having that kind of major sort of influence on the future of society and how things are going to proceed. So that's quite a spectrum. So let's go back into some of this. On the loss, that caused you to be more sort of spiritual, or think about it from a philosophical standpoint too. In terms of
absolutely, Stephen. Yeah. I mean, it threw me down that whole road. What are we doing here? And a simple question, who am I? If everyone can just sit down and just ask that simple question and come up with a with an answer, or at least try and just sort of just slowly engage into, who am I? Well, am I the body? Well, not really, because the cells are, coming and going every day. Am I my mind? No, my mind is changing the whole time. So this inquiry into who I am, and if one engages with that, if one is able to just sit and concentrate, and just be with that question. I just go a bit deeper than the surface layers that I've just been inquiring into now. You get to a much deeper place, and I think it's an important part of every human being's life, because that orientates you, and that orientation is just so important, for what you do. And I think it's purely from a performance point of view. If you're orientated in the right way, you're going to perform a lot better, than someone who isn't quite orientated. So these deeper questions, I think, drive a much needed, sort of direction in one's life. Yeah.
And then we talked about spreadsheets and how they had an impact in your life, but you hear Microsoft with their Excel spreadsheet, their Microsoft 365 suite, they're now embedding AI into it, right? This foundation model capability, which means you'll be able to do things without having a lot of skill. You'll be able to tell the system to do things for you. It reminds me of like a Star Trek feel to it, right?
It really is. I mean, the way that this is accelerating, and I mean, Microsoft themselves talk about the frenetic implementation of AI at the moment, and you know, you know, we're in an interesting space. I think it would be very fair. I mean, all AI models are trained, and so what are you training it on? And so the biases, we have to just be extremely careful of. And I think that we're certainly, our generation are okay, but the generations below us who've grown up in the digital age have become accustomed to accepting, what the computer says. And I have deep concerns about the biases in these AI models. Obviously, in the example that you're giving in Excel, that be more pragmatic. Give me, a model that does this or does that. So there's no biases there. But yes, and again, just the power, in the hands of people, who are able to command these technologies. I mean, we use Microsoft stuff. We use the Azure sort of cloud platform, and there's a whole section there called cognitive services, which has all of these bits and pieces in it. And a group of, it always astounds me, for having come through the various layers of technology through the years, it astounds me now that a group of 5 guys who are quite bright can sit down and really architect and develop something that can scale in a serverless sort of way, can scale to a global entity very quickly, whereas previously you would have to think, well, we're going to need to drop, we need to drop servers in this country now because we're starting to expand there. And, is there latency between the two countries, and all this type of stuff that, wanted to really architect in a completely different way. These cloud platforms with all of these services embedded in them are just phenomenally powerful. And AI is just one component in that all that power. So yeah, interesting times.
I'm also intrigued. I mean, it sounds like you were born in South Africa, or
Yes. Yeah. Born on a farm. And this is really what got me into what I'm doing, is because I grew up on a farm in Africa. And just, if you've ever been in Africa, it gets under your skin. It just, the expanse, the stars, the animals, the feel of Africa is just really, really amazing. But then I got into the sort of financial world, where I was sitting in front of a screen and stuff like that. And there's always been this tension within me between, well, what can I do? Because, having worked in these investment banks and having a look at how markets directly impact the environment. We lived in an area in South Africa where there was this beautiful, actually now it's a World Heritage Site, but there's a lot of minerals in there, and there were the miners really wanting to mine that, and we it was just interesting how commodity prices, if commodity prices go up, those things become very attractive, and you know those miners will get in there and they will extract that. So how do we as a planet balance this and keep that balance? Yeah.
So how do you go from being raised on a farm and being one with nature to then working in investment banking at the intersection of IT and financing and derivatives?
Yeah.
People like
Yeah.
Goldman Sachs and the World Bank of Scotland, HSBC,
Yeah.
and you did that
Mm.
both in South Africa and London. How do you
Yeah.
bridge those two?
Yeah. Well, and again, this is the problem I'm trying to solve is that my love is obviously for, and I think it's been the case for many people, is obviously to do good in this world and love our fellow beings that occupy this planet with us, like these magnificent elephants and lions and rhino and in your part of the world bears and elk and all of that type of stuff. How do we look after them? Because I mean, the World Wildlife Fund came out the other day with a report in 22 saying that we've lost 69% of our wildlife populations in the last 50 years. And having living in Africa and being on the ground here, you see that. You see the extensive destruction of forests, of old growth forests, of habitats for wildlife and intensive agriculture and all of that. And in those early days, obviously that's the space that I wanted to go into, but there was no money. And this is the difficult thing, these guys that were working out there, doing amazing work, were getting paid nothing, and I saw that it wasn't sustainable. As sad as it is, money is an integral part of a solution for good. And if you leave that part out, which is what a lot of well-intentioned people do, is they go out with all the best intentions, but they don't quite have the practical financing and the financial component, which makes up the full package that you need to take this on, and to do the good that you want to do. So my thinking was, well, let me get into the financial world and into that space. So that led me into and I just had an aptitude for maths, and so I sort of moved down the commercial sort of line and ended up with a sort of honors degree in corporate finance and corporate strategy, which then led me to various investment banks. So I sort of got into that, and then, as I say, this has been the tension that I've always carried, and finally I'm sort of back and working at that, which I'm sure we're going to get into a bit later.
So you grow up on a farm, you're sort of one with nature. You realize that you have to have the financial aspect. So you get an education in finance and strategy, and you end up with these really famous financial firms, and you work there. But you have a technology part to this history of yours. Where did you gain that technology expertise? Just by doing it, or did you
Yeah.
additional training in that, or how did that come up?
Yeah, and that's interesting. I sort of tend to side with Elon Musk on this one, and that is that degrees and everything mean nothing. What you've done, what you've practically done means something. So while sitting in these investment banks, I was modeling these instruments, and obviously you need some sort of tool. So I obviously chose Excel, and then you need more data. So then you need to understand databases. So it was a self sort of teaching of how to and then you need to do proper queries, and you need to then get into big data, and and off you go. So it was a case of just in time education. Fortunately, I have friends and people around me that knew a lot more than me, and I had the financial side and they had the tech side. So we would combine brains, and obviously, 3 years of working with this tech, that's sort of how it developed. And it's one of these things. I had an aptitude for picking up tech quite quickly, so I was put into that space the whole time. So it was always, why don't you do that? So I ended up actually spending, even though my background is in finance, I actually spent a lot more time in tech. And architecting and designing systems so that we could get the results that we wanted. So yeah, that's how. There's no degrees in IT, and funnily enough, when I left Goldman Sachs, I had to interview the person for my position, and I had a number of Oxford and Harvard and various other students come through, and all of which I wasn't impressed with. They had all the theory, but in terms of truly understanding, like what's going to go on here, I didn't find that they had that. And there were guys that were sort of, call them street fighters, whatever, people that had got their hands very dirty, actually solving problems, really solving problems, deep, financial problems and or technical problems. I engaged and I tended to connect with them a lot more. So yeah, that's sort of where I sit on that spectrum.
So how did you move from this background, farming, to, okay, so we see the history of investment banking to how you got into this idea of technology and infusion of technology and the marriage between the two, and developing this expertise as required. But then you became an entrepreneur, which is a big leap, by the way. So what's that genesis of being an entrepreneur? And you founded a bunch of companies.
Yeah, so that was because I was getting on a train in the dark in London. I was getting out of that train in the dark and walking to my office, working during the day, and saw none of the daylight that was quite short there. Getting out of the office in the dark and getting back into a train and going home, and I just thought, no, as someone who uh, is who I am, I needed to get back into the sunshine, and I needed to actually get back into Africa. So I came back to Africa, and I didn't want to do the same thing in Africa. I didn't want to come back and just get into an investment bank here and do the same thing in Johannesburg or Cape Town or whatever. So that meant I had to think, and that led me to that's where my entrepreneurial sort of side came to the fore. South Africa was and still is going through a lot of transformation. So it made it more difficult actually to just get a conventional job. So it meant that one had to think on one's feet, and so I initially started a training an IT training company because I had all these skills in finance and in IT and stuff, and which did well. And what I found is that we ended up a lot of people that I was training say, well, why don't you just do this? So I started a consultancy side to the training side, and that did very well. And in fact, we ended up, I'm still there. Government sort of came to us and asked us for some things, and we developed some government systems for the South African government, and that is one company that is still running. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, being an entrepreneur is such a big leap. I mean, being in finance can be quite a conservative business, right?
Yeah.
And entrepreneurship is sort of the opposite in a way, in many respects. So it's interesting that you bridged the two successfully. There's two parts of your background that I'm curious about. Tell me more about the steering committee for the blockchain, this BC 100 plus. What is that?
Yeah, so what we've got is we've got a world in which we've got various means with which we've been going about things. For example, the EU has been, or the UN have been handing money out to various countries, whether that be Southeast Asia or South America or Africa or wherever. And over the last 70 years, we haven't made much progress we've done good, but not to the extent that we need to. And so the BC 100 Plus is basically having a look at the blockchain technology and seeing how we can apply that to really reinvent the way that we are doing things on this planet. So I, in particular, as you know, have founded this and I'm pioneering this platform, a nature finance platform. Maybe I should just reverse it back and just give a bit of background of the platform, and then that'll lead into the BC 100 Plus. So what I'm doing is, and as I was saying, biodiversity and conservation, wildlife conservation literally gets no money. From a government spend point of view, it's always health, education, infrastructure, and all of those big numbers up at the top, and very little to nothing for nature. And if you consider that our $100 trillion economy rests on, and our lives rest on nature, and fortunately in the last sort of 2-3 years, the world has woken up to these tipping points and various problems that we're having with the ocean and with the land and with the air and stuff like that, and we're starting to get it, that if we don't look after that, the risks, and in fact the risks, straightforward financial risks to us are just too severe. So it's prudent to just have a look at these things and maybe sort them out. So fortunately the world has woken up to that, but it's an incredibly hard space to fund. How do you fund the preservation of, say, rhino? How do you fund the preservation of, say, the Amazon forest? Because it's not a money spinner. You can't bring money in there. So it's a very difficult sort of space to finance. And this is something I've been looking at very, very intently and carefully. And recently, we've had the advent and the explosion of this new field of finance called nature finance, which is basically how we can integrate nature into the world's financial models. And this requires, it's a lot bigger than just a few sentences, because it requires basically a systemic shift in the way that we go about our business. And that systemic shift will ultimately mean bringing the value of nature into our financial decision making. So I've developed this platform. It's called Wadappt, and really it is, what it does is it takes data from the ground, environmental data, ecological data, biodiversity data from the ground, and packages it into units of positive impact, which people can come and buy. When I say people, corporates, the UN, the EU, etc., can come and buy. These packets of positive impact are blockchain based. They are 100% verified, etc., etc. So we are creating trust from the ground in these remote areas, and this is important because we live in a world of fake news, of modified images, of not really knowing at all what the truth is. And so what I'm trying to re-establish is an irrefutable proof of the fact that this positive impact has happened, package it into a digital asset and sell it. And so that's a very different way of doing money coming into Africa from say Europe or the UN or whatever. And there are a whole bunch of things which this does, because the data and the structure of the data and the intention behind the data and the projects on the ground can all be designed and developed and run by Africans. And so it's putting the power, this technology, this blockchain technology is putting the power back in the hands of the people on the ground. And then it's serving it up. So in essence, we're basically serving up positive impact for even companies in Africa, to buy, and or entities from overseas or whatever to buy. And so this BC 100 plus, how I got involved in it is it's basically a project which is to have a look at these new ways of doing things differently. Very much aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and very much aligned with utilizing blockchain. Now, while I do utilize blockchain in what I'm doing, I don't use it extensively. I'm still very much in the fiat world. So, in other words, it will not be cryptocurrencies that you would use. People will arrive on my platform with dollars or euros or whatever currency it is, and they will procure and work in the conventional world. But under the hood is a whole lot of blockchain, ensuring that the trust of the data emanating from the ground in these remote parts of Africa is 100% intact. So we basically rebuilding the trust, which is very broken. And I think that would be a comment that I would make about where we are in the world at the moment, is that there's just so much that is broken that we need to fix. And one of those things is trust. We just have to re-establish that. And obviously I'm hoping, and I'm betting on this, and I might be wrong, but I'm hoping that if I establish these clear lines of trust between what is happening on the ground in Africa all the way through to the people that are procuring it. And this now talks to this task force on nature-related financial disclosure. So companies are going to have to disclose their impact that they're having on biodiversity. And my hope is that they use my technology so that there's no greenwashing. There's so much greenwashing happening in this space, and I'm hoping to create, those corporations that come in and work with me and or procure these trusted certificates, sort of set a trend, and that trend being that we're not going to try and mess with things. We are going to work with integrity and work with truth, because we have the technology and we have the tools at our disposal to actually do this. So that's what the BC 100 Plus is. It's a team of people. You've got Mr. Raymond van Eerman, who sort of heads it up, of EPE in Brussels, and they're very connected to the European Union. And in fact, we have the patronage of the 77th President of the United Nations General Assembly for what we are doing. And really the idea behind that whole project is to bring the best projects forward and utilize the best components of blockchain technology such that we can just reinvent the way that we are doing things, particularly in this global commons space on the globe. So I hope that's given you a bit of an idea. It's a lot more than that, but that's hopefully it's given you a bit of an idea.
I see. So what I'm hearing is that the BC 100 Plus is really tied to the UN. It's tied to SDG actions as well, but using blockchain technology as a means of provenance and trust and integrity and so on. So you can trust what's happening under the hood and any kind of asset representation that's happening.
Yeah.
I notice you're also a forum member of the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, so that must be the credit aspect that's associated with biodiversity, maybe the financial aspect of it. And I can see them then tying into this thing called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. And again, this is where if you can get corporations who want to have ESG, and they want it to report it in a trusted way, but they also want to ensure that it's not grounded on just words. There's actual acts being performed that'll be for the benefit of humanity or life and Earth ecosystem. So I could see these three pieces tying together. Did I get that correct? So the financial.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right, Stephen. And I want to just dig into this a little bit, because it's actually become a very complicated space. So I think it's just important to understand that climate finance, this is sort of climate change and all of that. That's climate, and that relates primarily to the energy sector, because what they're dealing with is greenhouse gases. Okay, so 1 ton of carbon is a carbon credit. Okay, so one ton of greenhouse gases is a carbon credit, and it's quite easy to measure that. Okay, and the world is quite familiar with carbon credits. Okay, and they sort of know about carbon credits. It's a financial instrument. You can get it on your balance sheet. You can trade it. Its price fluctuates up and down based on supply and demand. So it's an asset class. It's a straightforward asset class, which we're all relatively familiar with. But it's very important to understand that that is climate finance. Now, climate finance is slightly, or climate related sort of issues is they linked, but they are different to biodiversity issues. And the argument is this, and that is that we may be able to balance our climate account. In other words, we might be able to get to net zero or carbon neutral, as a planet, and that in itself is a challenge. But the point is that if we've lost species, if we've lost our biodiversity, and if we've lost if we've lost nature, then we haven't won. So we actually, as a planet, we are going from carbon, the whole carbon debate, or challenge, and we are saying we need to go deeper. We need to actually go further into nature and biodiversity. Now, as I've said, carbon is quite simple. 1 ton of CO2 gas, carbon credit, whereas nature, how do we quantify nature? Do we quantify it? The ethical concerns there, do we monetize nature, and all of these things. So it's a very complicated space, and the Biodiversity Credits Alliance has been set up again for people like myself that are operating in this space to try and work this out. And there's no standards at the moment. We're all still trying to get to some sort of standard whereby we can create an asset class that is a biodiversity credit. And when I say credit, that's another problem that we just need to get into, because credits typically mean, and carbon credits typically mean, that I'm going to pollute this much, so therefore I need to buy so many carbon credits. So it's it's an offsetting mechanism. And I think the world, and certainly the generations younger than us, have got to the point where we're not going to offset anymore. We need to be nature positive. We need to get positive, because we've broken stuff down so much. We need to be in that regenerative finance space, which is not sustainable finance, but it's regenerative finance. And that's a whole new game that and obviously that knocks onto this whole conversation about GDP and maximizing shareholder wealth and degrowth and all of these topics that are all about at the moment. So the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, you're exactly right. It's gonna, we bracing, and there are a couple of people in this space that are putting some very good ideas, but in my opinion, there's no clear winner at the moment. And I'm obviously contributing to that conversation. I have my own ideas about where we should be going with that. But the idea is, once we get that asset class together, then corporates can participate in that market and play in that space, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I can see how that relates to this. You're on the task force or contributor to this nature-related financial disclosure, and this is this trusted way of disclosing what's happening when you're working with biodiversity. So the three are really interconnected.
Yeah.
And then you're the founder and CEO of this biodiversity impact funding company called Wadappt, and it's a marketplace. And I can see now why you're connecting global capital markets directly to people and projects on the ground, because right now you don't have this democratization of global capital markets to invest in this area. And then you're working towards this being an asset class as well, right? So
yeah.
I mean, I can relate to this because we made an investment in a company. I'm an investor where we what they're trying to do, and what they have done very successfully, is to create global capital market entries, other capital sources into insurance-linked security risk, right? So,
Yeah.
which didn't really exist before, and now they're doing that. So I can. So can you opening up this to other capital sources and creating some kind of mechanism so it's easy or easier, because you're doing all of
Yeah.
the work, all of the back office work, I guess, all of the tech
Yeah.
and all of the
Yeah.
connectivity, the connective tissue. You're doing
Yes,
all of
that's it.
that so that people can engage, and then I can see how the financial disclosure part fits in, because you want to be able to trust this thing. You want to put it into your reporting, corporate reporting, and then the
Yep.
Credits Alliance, so you can somehow assign some kind of measurable piece to this,
Yep.
which ties into the blockchain, because that's
Yeah.
I can see why you're saying, though, it's just not simple, though it's complex, right? So you're
No,
really creating a new ecosystem
that's it.
able to finance and protect biodiversity, right?
That's it. That's it, Stephen. I would say that we are 2 years at best away from getting standards in place and understanding what these biodiversity sort of nature positive units would be. And we simply do not have 2 years. So so I've actually gone ahead and I've built a full platform from data being captured on the ground, all the way through to a marketplace where, as you've correctly said, I'm connecting the capital market. So anyone from anywhere in the world can come onto this marketplace and they can buy these, what I call nature positive certificates, or they're trusted digital assets, which they can buy, okay, at like you would on Amazon or on any of the platforms. You can search, you can filter for your specific um, area that you want to procure nature positive impact. You can buy these things and actually own that. So you actually own the attribution. So in other words, someone goes out and does something positive, works, produces this positive impact, and and they've obviously funded themselves to produce that. So when you buy it, you're actually giving the money back to them, and you're owning that positive impact. And so I call them certificates instead of credits. So I'm creating biodiversity certificates, and the platform is alive. And I've just got back from Namibia, where we are working with a couple of the governmental and some NGOs there, and we're on the verge of getting our first certificates coming to market, which will be available to everyone to buy. And so really what we're doing is we are simplifying. And there's this thing called asymmetry of size. You have these big entities like the UN or the EU or whatever, and they want to spend, say, $1 billion on biodiversity upliftment in Africa. Now, to go and spend that money, it's going to consume a vast amount of it, actually vetting and verifying and going through thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of projects and clumping them all together and getting them all to the right place, so that you can then spend that money. And similarly for corporates, who want to show a nature positive stance and position. What we are doing is we're packaging all of that into very neat, trusted blocks, and they can simply come in and just buy that, bang, and then they can actually hold that and then show that to their investors, show that to their shareholders, show that to their governments, and say, this is irrefutable proof of what I've used your tax money for, or what I've used your corporate money, or whatever it is, whatever money is coming in. You can then say to whoever it is that you are reporting to, here's irrefutable proof of what I've done. And I believe, and I'm hoping that this will be revolutionary. And you're exactly right. There is no market at the moment for this. And so the platform, the Wadappt platform that we are creating, and to be clear, it's a voluntary market. It's not guarded by any regulations at the moment, because there aren't the regulations. So we're creating this voluntary market such that buyers can come in and procure. these nature positive certificates. And my hope is that those corporates that do are rewarded, because shareholders want to know that, positive things are being done, and it's not all just being greenwashed. Companies' share prices get hammered if scandals break that, that they are lying about the diesel, in your Volkswagen or or whatever it is. When these things break, it's not good for a company as a whole, and it represents risks. And in buying these and in buying this, you're starting to catalyze a positive cycle. You're starting to catalyze a systemic shift, actually, in bringing nature into the financial world. And this is just phase one of many steps that we have ahead, which we hope will develop into something quite sophisticated, and just bring the nature and finance sort of thing into balance, because it's way out of balance at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions come to mind. I can see, I mean, regulatory forces will be involved at some point. They must be looking at these kinds of things that are happening and getting their heads around it, because you can get a situation where they want to protect retail investors, right? That could get involved, and because there isn't any regulatory policies, or it's probably very early in terms of regulatory policy. There could be policies this fits under. I don't know. So how are you managing that aspect? Because you don't want to get on the wrong side of that either, right?
No.
So that's one question, and then I have some ones about the UN, but so
Yeah. So that, I mean, if you look at the whole all of the work that's been done on supply chains at the moment, supply chains, corporates that are bringing fish to the market, or diamonds to the market, or whatever it is, those supply chains are coming under incredible scrutiny, because where are those fish coming from? Where are those diamonds? Where is that gold? Where is those fabrics coming from? So those supply chains, there's a lot of attention being paid to those supply chains because of the potential problems that are embedded in those supply chains. So that's one of them. And then secondly, I'm preempting, having seen all the regulatory stuff in the financial world, and then even more so seeing all the shenanigans that has gone on in the cryptocurrency space. And this, as I say, I've sort of reversed out of that space, and I'm rather now dealing with just the core blockchain technology and with the sort of fiat world. What I'm doing is I'm putting my best foot forward, in anticipation for these regulations, and hopefully will be a contributor to the creation of these regulations. And solid, regulations aren't a bad thing, if done well. And certainly with the people that I'm working with at the World Wildlife Fund and various other entities, who are at the forefront of this whole game. We are, as I say, just doing our best to put our best foot forward now. And the word now is just so important, because we have to act now. And as I say, I've developed this platform to function now, and we will evolve it and we will develop it as all of this happens. But we cannot wait for all of that to happen, because, as I say, 2 to 5 years is the best estimate that I can come up with, getting all of this right from all of that angle. And we really don't have that time, and we do have to act now.
have you approached with regards to the ITU, there's an organization called the International Telecommunications Union. They're 158 years old this year, I believe. They were formed, so they predate the UN, and their purpose was to produce standards, right? So when Morse code came out, and it's an international standard, you need some body to say this is a standard, or area codes used in mobile, or compression codes that are used when you do online video. Those are all standards that came from ITU, this International Telecommunications Union. Seems such a good fit for them, because they work with corporates, and they work with the UN, with governments, and they also work with research institutes and NGOs. So and I believe they've done some blockchain work already, but this biodiversity side and the financial disclosure side, I think the combination of the three would be a great working group within ITU. Have you talked to them at all, or?
You know, I haven't at all. And obviously, you know, the carbon credit standard setters such as Gold Standard, Vera, and all of these standard setters, they're obviously spending a lot of their energy and time getting into this biodiversity space, and in fact coming out with standards at the moment. But having said that, I mean, the whole carbon space is on its head at the moment because there's been so much controversy around and exposure to the fact that a lot of the standards have not been right. So a lot of carbon credits that have been developed and sold and monies exchanged and traded and all the rest have turned out to be not the products that they were meant to be. So it's almost a good thing because it's now said, look, guys, we need to get this right. We need to set proper standards. And it's just such a difficult thing, Stephen. You know, a tree in Vancouver, how much is the value of that tree from a biodiversity and from a nature point of view to a tree in, say, South Africa, to a tree in Japan, to a tree in Australia? You know, that's the sort of question. And a tree is one thing. And what about a lion? You know, what are these values? And that's almost, and that example that I've just given you isn't the right lens to be looking at this, because we're trying to put a value, a financial value on it, which some people are doing. I don't quite see that as the right way to go, but these are the complexities that we're dealing with at the moment. And in fact, while I'm here, what I've done is I've said, you know what, that's not going to be solved, as I say, in a hurry. So what I've rather done is I've said, look, this ecosystem, okay, what is it going to cost to fix that? You know, and that can often be a lot less than these big numbers that are bandied about. You know, the UN is saying that we need 700 billion annually to fix biodiversity. 700 billion, that's a lot of money. And I'm saying, well, you know, let's have a look at what are the cost bases, because that's a number that you can really find. It's tangible. There's a history behind it. It's very, from a price discovery point of view, it's very clear. It's a very clear number that you can find. And I'm basically quantifying my nature certificates off that cost basis rather than going into very esoteric sort of models of how we value stuff. So that's what I'm doing as a first phase. And then obviously, if these models do evolve and we do get to some sort of understanding globally of how we can quantify a unit of biodiversity or a unit of nature, then we'll integrate that in as we go. But I adopt the more conservative approach initially, and then we'll move on to the more esoteric stuff later. Yeah.
You know, it just seems such a natural fit for ITU to start, you know, just contacting them. But Bilal Jamousi is the head of study groups, and getting a study group formed around this, and then a focus group, and then you can work towards some kind of global agreement of some sort, right, to move your initiative along. And
Would
they
love to
definitely
meet
have all
them.
the different stakeholders represented. So that's I'm just brainstorming with you. Have you
Yeah.
talked to Michael Miam at all on your, you know, it's something that you may want to do. He just came out, he's the immediate past chair of the UK Sustainable Investment and Financial Association, which just prior to him retiring from chair, it was about 19 trillion pounds, British pounds, and assets under management. And I could see this piquing his interest because he's always looking at it from an ESG financing standpoint. How can you do something and it's trusted, and greenwashing's a big and he is an ESG investor as well, and he has co-founded a number of family office events hosted by governments, and he's on the board of KIN. So you're part of KIN, right? The Knowledge Impact Network.
Yep.
So they're part of that community. I'm just thinking this would fit. Krista Goya and of the Leaders on Purpose, and they have an African program. In fact, at the African Forum last year in September in New York, the same week as the weeks as the UNGA. They had the founder and CEO of the Equity Bank, and it seems to me that there's a lot of resources, but they don't know where to put their resources, right?
Yeah.
And I think you've got something here that I think would be of interest to them. So I'm just kind of brainstorming ideas.
Yeah.
And we
Stephen.
question. So
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much. And I really want to say thank you, because what I've been working, and it takes an immense amount of effort to work from the ground up. Okay, because engaging with communities, engaging with governments, just takes an incredibly long time. And someone like yourself and those names that you've just been mentioning, if I can create the demand, if I can say, oh, okay, these guys have got, $10,000 or $100,000 or hopefully $100 million, set aside, and as the demand side. Okay. And because that is, and you've mentioned something very important. I go to conference after conference. I talk at them. And I listen to some conferences, and every single conference says we need to innovate and we need to move fast, but no one comes up with anything. They're talking and talking and talking. And I've gone away from all of that, and I've gone actually onto the ground in Africa, and I've got some of the best tech guys around me, and we've built and actually done something. We've actually put a platform together. So it's that demand. If I can just get a group of players together to say, look, we will buy, okay, and I know that there's that demand, then I can start teeing up everything on the ground here in Africa. And it's exactly that. It's trusted from the ground all the way through to the top, and the money coming down, by the way. So it's data going up is trusted. And then you have a full audit. Having been in the financial space, I've got a full audit all the way down onto the ground, because that's also a very important component, is the data going up and the money coming down, to make sure that that all just stays completely intact. And I believe that once people get that, as you say, there's a lot of money floating around. But they don't quite know, and there's a break in trust, and so I'm hoping that once this catches fire, I think it'll move quite fast. And fortunately, I've got the platform with which to move into 20 countries in Africa, and potentially even across the globe. With 270,000 square kilometers of biodiversity and stuff, and the impact can really be big if I can just get that demand coming in and just say, look, guys, okay, what have you got, so that I know, then I can start teeing up, because that's the marketplace that I'm creating. I've got the supply and the demand, and tee those two up. That would be amazing.
So, David, we got about a minute left. So, and this is the last question. What sort of insights or recommendations do you want to give to the audience?
Well, sure. It's just that we live in precarious times, but also very exciting times. And I certainly am loving what I'm doing. And I would just love to engage with anyone who has the passion and interest that I have. And in particular, and sorry to be blunt, but those who have the demand side of it, I would love to work with corporates or high net worth individuals, or anyone who's got the demand side of it. And because there is an immense amount of trusted good that can be done, and that excites me. So I'd leave everyone with that.
Well, thank you, David. I really enjoyed our conversation today, and thank you for coming in, sharing so many of your insights. And you're really working on some really interesting contributions here that can have permanent, lasting effect on the planet. So thank you again.
Yeah, Stephen, and thank you. It really is a great honor and privilege to be sitting and talking with you, and really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.